Order, order. I call Alice MacDonald to move the motion.
Thank you, Sir Jeremy, and it's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. There are many things we disagree on in this House, but I hope in this debate we will find some clear areas of agreement. Though the impact of conflict on women and girls is undeniable and unacceptable, the women are not only victims, they are survivors, combatants, leaders, human rights defenders, and their role in preventing and resolving conflict and peace building is key. And that the UK has a crucial role to play in this area. I'm sure members will want to focus on specific geographical areas, and in my remarks I will focus on the overall situation as well as two specific conflicts, Sudan and Afghanistan. So firstly, let me set out the situation globally. It only takes turning on the news or indeed scrolling on social media to see that conflict is raging all around us, from Gaza to Sudan to Ukraine. There are many more conflicts we barely speak about anymore, like that in the Democratic Republic of Congo. And women and girls continue to be disproportionately affected by conflict. According to the UN, in 2023, an estimated 612 million women and girls lived within 50 kilometres of a conflict, an increase of 41% since 2015. And if you think about that number, it's more than the population of the United States of America and Brazil combined. And the impact of conflict takes multiple forms, from sexual violence to girls losing years of education. And women are dying, literally dying, because of the impact of war. The proportion of women killed in armed conflicts doubled in 2023 compared to the previous year. And sexual violence in conflict has also risen dramatically, with UN-verified cases soaring by 50%, and those are only the ones that we know about. Half of those displaced because of persecution, conflict and violence are, of course, women and girls, forced to live far from home or indeed in refugee camps where often they are still not safe. These are some of the most direct impacts, but there are so many more on women's health, education and their freedoms. Women and girls are more likely to go hungry in conflict. Attacks on health facilities impact on women and girls' access to sexual and reproductive health care. As Plan International has highlighted, the impact on girls is devastating. Girls' schools have been deliberately targeted to stop them going to school. And of the 119 million girls out of school, more than a quarter are in conflict or crisis-affected countries.
Will my friend give way? And I congratulate my friend on securing this important debate and on her excellent speech. One of the consequences of war and conflict is the disruption in education. And the educational void is catastrophic, not just for girls themselves, but for their families, communities and nations too. And a lack of education for girls also undermines peace building. Studies show that educated women are more key to rebuilding post-conflict societies, participating in governance and preventing the resurgence of violence. So does my friend agree with me that the UK must champion the protection of education in conflict zones and hold governments and militias to account when they attack schools or use them for military purposes?
I thank my friend for that contribution, and I do agree, and I know this government, and indeed the previous government, did a lot on girls' educations, as did the former Prime Minister, Gordon Brown, who still continues to do so. It's not only an impact on girls present, it is an attack on their future and on the future of all of us. And, of course, we have seen the rolling back of women's rights. And nowhere is this more evident than in Afghanistan, described as the worst women's rights crisis in the world. The Taliban are steadily erasing women and girls from public life and suppressing every single one of their rights. If you are female in Afghanistan, you cannot go to school, you cannot go to the park, you cannot travel, leave your house without a male chaperone. You cannot work for a non-governmental organisation, which will have a devastating impact on the delivery of aid. You cannot study midwifery or medicine, and indeed over Christmas it was reported that the Taliban have banned windows to stop women even being seen. This is gender apartheid. I went to Afghanistan in 2011. I met many women who were determined to shape the future of their country. The politicians I met are no longer able to serve. The women working in domestic abuse refuges are not working anymore. Indeed, those shelters are shut. Those women are still fighting for the future of their country. It's their voices we must listen to. It is their demands we must listen to, and we must act. And that must include heeding their calls to recognise what is happening as gender apartheid and as a crime under international law. That would mark a historic step towards ending this abhorrent discrimination and also send an important message to Afghan women and girls that we stand with them. We must also make it clear, the international community and the UK, that we won't normalise relationships with the Taliban until they end this war on women. So I'd ask the Minister in her response, and I know she cares passionately about this, to answer specifically what the government is doing and whether the government will support these calls to recognise what is happening as gender apartheid and pursue this through the UN so it is being treated as a war crime. And we can all do our part. I joined many members of Parliament, as did many around me here, in signing a letter organised by the member for the Gower to the England and Wales Cricket Board, asking them to speak out and boycott their match against Afghanistan, because all action matters. Let me turn now to Sudan, where an estimated 6.9 million people are currently at risk of gender-based violence, where 75% of girls are not in school, where there is evidence of mass and systemic rape, where women are reportedly committing suicide out of fear of that rape. Evidence shows that women and girls from ethnic minority groups are being deliberately targeted. The accounts are horrific. I read one from a 35-year-old Nuba woman. She described how 6 RSF fighters stormed into her family compound. She said, "My husband and my son tried to defend me, so one of the RSF fighters shot and killed them. They then kept raping me, all 6 of them." Sudan has been described as the world's forgotten conflict. As penholder on Sudan at the United Nations, will the Minister set out what we can do specifically now to support women in Sudan, but to change that situation so it isn't the world's forgotten conflict anymore? Does she agree that the United Nations and African Union should urgently deploy a mission to protect civilians in Sudan, mandated and resourced to address sexual violence? And does she think the UN member states should bolster support for the UN fact-finding mission, as the Secretary-General has urged, to help pave the way forward towards meaningful accountability? And on Gaza, and I know more members will speak about the situation in the Middle East. As I said in the Chamber recently, there are 50,000 pregnant women in Gaza right now who cannot access the care that they need. Imagine giving birth in the hell that is Gaza right now. And if the ban on UNRWA goes ahead at the end of this month, that will have a devastating impact on everybody, and also women and girls. So I hope the Minister will update what we are doing to push more on that front. Now, many people may ask, why should we care in the UK about this? Why should we care about what is happening to women in other parts of the world? Well, it's the right thing to do, and that was set out by the last government in their National Action Plan on Women, Peace and Security. And it's also the smart thing to do, because empowered and engaged women means more secure and prosperous societies. And I also believe because when women's rights are rolled back anywhere, they are rolled back everywhere.
Will my honourable friend give way on that? I'd like to congratulate my honourable friend for securing this really vital debate. And as she knows, the ongoing climate crisis is making more regions of the world uninhabitable, fueling these conflicts that disproportionately affect women and girls. In humanitarian conflicts, up to 70% of women and girls experience gender-based violence, and we must empower them by elevating their voices and leadership in times of crisis. Does my honourable friend agree with me that robust systems must be in place to provide the vital support necessary for women and girls in these times of crisis?
I thank my honourable friend for that contribution and raising the important point about climate change, because that has a very detrimental impact on women and girls everywhere, but also in conflict situations. And indeed, it is a driver of conflict, as we will see when it comes to resource scarcity, for example. So I welcome that point, and I agree that it must be a key part of these conversations. So let me turn now to the action needed, and I'll focus on 3 specific areas: international leadership, aid and peace building. This year marks the 25th anniversary of the UN Security Council Resolution 1325 on women, peace and security. That was hailed at the time as an absolutely landmark agreement, and it included really important measures on protecting women and girls in conflict, supporting their leadership and their role in peace processes. So this year is a golden opportunity to renew the UK's leadership, and indeed the international community's leadership on this important agenda. It's also an opportunity to review the plan that the previous government set out, because we know that on many elements of it we need to do much, much more. For example, we know that men who commit sexual violence and other atrocities against women and girls still have impunity. So on tackling sexual violence in conflict and holding perpetrators to account, can the Minister update us on what is happening? And the previous action plan also did not include, I believe, Sudan and the occupied Palestinian territories as focus countries. Obviously, since it was agreed, the situation has changed fundamentally. So does the Minister think that they should now be included in that plan? Secondly, on aid, we know that aid does not always reach women. Only 25% of women affected by conflict receive essential relief and recovery aid. And the aid cuts under the previous government did have a devastating impact on women and girls. So can the Minister confirm we will reverse those trends, including with a specific target for the percentage of odour focused on gender equality, as organisations like CARE have called for, and also that we will invest in women-led and women-focused organisations? Could she also tell us that when we are announcing packages of humanitarian aid, and I welcome the 50 million announced for Syria, that we are also ensuring that that reaches women and girls? Finally, women's role in peace building. Women's participation is not a nice to have in any area that we are talking about, and it's certainly not when it comes to peace processes. It is fundamental for effective peace building, but women are still not adequately involved in these processes. Yet we know when women participate in peace processes, it works. Their participation increases the probability of an agreement lasting more than 15 years by 35%. And we've seen women play a really important role in many peace processes, from Libya to Liberia to Colombia. So, Chair, let me come to my conclusion. The UK must work actively to promote the fundamentals of the Women, Peace and Security agenda: prevention, participation, protection and relief and recovery. Women are not victims. Women must not be voiceless. The progress that has been made on this agenda would not have happened without the courage and perseverance of women. And we must be hopeful for change. In the words of Plan International's report, still we dream. Indeed, a survey by Women for Women International showed that across 14 countries, 81% of women are hopeful that there will be change, that their circumstances will improve in the next 5 years. But that will not happen without the international community acting. And as we progress in this debate, I am sure we will all have in our minds different women and girls impacted by conflict, like the Yazidi women, the girls abducted by Boko Haram, the Israeli women slaughtered and raped on October the 7th, the women and girls living in hell in Gaza right now, where nowhere and nobody is safe, the women of Ukraine, the women of Iran, the women of Syria who are hopeful for a better tomorrow. So let us resolve to do what we can as parliamentarians to tackle the scourge of violence against women and girls wherever it is found and in whatever form it takes.
Thank you very much indeed. Can I remind all members that you should bob or stand briefly, even if you have already notified the Chair that you want to speak, if you do want to contribute to the debate. And the question is that this House has considered the impact of conflict on women and girls. Laura Kirk-Smith.
Thank you, Mr Chair, and it's a pleasure to serve under your chairship. And I'd like to thank my honourable friend, the member for Norwich North, for securing today's important debate. Before I go further, Chair, I'd like to declare an interest, having previously been Executive Director of the International Rescue Committee in the UK, part of a global humanitarian agency that supports women in conflict and crisis around the world. As we have heard from my honourable friend, women and girls are suffering disproportionately from rising conflict around the world. The number of women living in conflict zones has surged. In 2022, around 600 million women, that's more than 1 in 7 of the world's women, lived in or in close proximity to an armed conflict, and that's double the figure it was in the 1990s. As we've also heard, conflict impacts on women in many specific ways, which includes increased sexual violence, loss of livelihoods, and worsening healthcare, resulting in higher death rates even from preventable causes. I want to share some examples from 2 particularly brutal ongoing conflicts, Gaza and Sudan, but then move on to talk about solutions. In Gaza, women are being impacted in so many ways, but let me talk about reproductive health in particular, having heard some very powerful testimony at the International Development Select Committee. Pregnant women living through that conflict are 3 times more likely to miscarry, and if they do carry their babies to full term, they're 3 times more likely to die in childbirth due to lack of access to appropriate antenatal and postnatal medical care, lack of access to basic medicines, safe shelter, adequate nutrition. Nebel Farsak from the Palestinian Red Crescent told us at the Select Committee evidence session, almost 60,000 pregnant women in Gaza are lacking everything. They're malnourished, not able to receive the food they need, not even receiving the proper health care they deserve. They're living in shelters, they're sharing one toilet, thousands of people. You cannot even imagine how a pregnant woman has to endure such inhumane conditions. Because of the collapsing healthcare system, as a pregnant woman, you barely have the luxury of delivering your baby in a hospital, and if you're lucky enough to, you cannot stay. Many women have had C-sections without anaesthesia because it had run out. And this is one of many continuous struggles with hospitals lacking anaesthesia, painkillers and other basic medications and medical supplies. Israeli authorities have denied the entry of many of these critical supplies, including the anaesthesia, oxygen cylinders, ventilators and other medicines. According to UNRWA, of the total and extremely limited humanitarian supplies that have entered Gaza since October 2023, just 2% of them were medical supplies. And on the 4th of November last year, UNFPA announced the attacks on hospitals have forced the only functioning neonatal intensive care unit in northern Gaza to close. Denying this access to newborn and maternal health care and the removal of the conditions necessary to give birth safely represent a grave threat to the survival of pregnant women and Palestinians more widely in Gaza. And the impact of the conflict in Sudan, I'd also like to touch on. My honourable friend has mentioned it, but it's having similarly grave consequences for women and girls. For example, the reports of gender-based violence in Sudan have drastically surged, encompassing really alarming incidents such as kidnapping, forced marriage, intimate partner violence, conflict-related sexual violence and child marriage. The UN has witnessed a staggering 288% increase in the number of survivors seeking gender-based violence case management services. And at least 6.7 million people within Sudan are at risk of gender-based violence. There are also cases of sexual exploitation driven by food security and water scarcity, along with severely limited access to essential post-rape care and to support services for survivors. These survivors are in desperate need of medical, psychological and mental health support. And yet, despite the horrific impacts of conflict on women that we've heard about, it's women in conflict zones who are often leading the response. Women are often the first responders. In Gaza, women make up 70% of frontline healthcare workers and 60% of caregivers. And we know that this can lead to improved healthcare outcomes. In Niger and Burkina Faso, for example, local organisations are nearly twice as likely to report increased caseloads of GBV compared with international organisations, suggesting that women are more likely to report violence to these local women's organisations. Women are also some of the chief advocates. For example, again in Niger, when groups of women, IDPs, internally displaced people, were excluded from receiving humanitarian aid, they lobbied district authorities to officially recognise their community and has secured in doing so services for people with disabilities and cash assistance for their community. When I spent time with Syrian refugees in Jordan in my previous role at IRC, I met incredible Syrian refugee women who had set up their own businesses on top of caring for their families. They were there without partners or had lost their partners in the war. But not only were they doing that, they were pushing donors to change their approach and to better support women refugees to be entrepreneurial and to earn a living alongside looking after their families. And again, women showing such great leadership, women are proving absolutely critical to building lasting peace in places where conflict is being brought to an end. And there's very strong evidence to demonstrate that the involvement of women and girls in peace building is key to achieving successful outcomes. Research shows that where women lead and participate in conflict prevention, response, recovery and peace building, societies are more stable and peace is more durable. Women's participation in peace negotiations, for example, results in peace agreements being 35% more likely to last at least 15 years. While the participation of civil society, including women's organisations, in peace processes makes them 64% less likely to fail. Yet, despite the evidence, this huge volume of evidence showing that women are best placed to understand and meet the needs of their communities before, during and after conflicts, too often their voices are still ignored. I'd like to just turn to two key solutions I'd like to highlight, and I've been really pleased to hear the Minister speak about her commitment to gender equality very passionately, and I know she's hit the ground running in terms of making that commitment and ambition a reality. I also welcome the Prime Minister's appointment of Lord Collins as the Special Representative on Preventing Sexual Violence in Conflict. I pay tribute to the many, many brilliant NGOs who are delivering important support for women in conflict and championing their rights, including with funding from our government, international NGOs like IRC, but like CARE, Plan and Save the Children, but most importantly, women's-led local groups like the International Committee for the Development of Peoples in Somalia and Right to Play in Pakistan and elsewhere. They are doing fantastic work, but I think there's two ways in particular in which we can do more. The first is focused on funding, and of course we have to recognise that all our government budgets are limited and that there are many competing priorities for those budgets, including for the global humanitarian and development budgets. It's just the reality that we're living in, but what we can do is get our limited budget working harder. And for example, or to give a few examples, we can expand the amount of multi-year funding available to organisations that support women and girls in conflict. It makes a real difference to their ability to plan and deliver their work effectively. We can ensure that funding is flexible to allow adaptation to the evolving needs of women and girls at different stages of conflict and crisis. We can introduce measurable targets to increase the amount and quality of funding that goes to women-led organisations within a particular humanitarian budget. And we can use our influence within the UN to reform the multilateral funding mechanisms, which are actually absolutely crucial in some contexts where funding is otherwise very difficult to get in, such as the UN OCHA's country-based pooled funds. And that would make it easier for women-led organisations to apply and to be successful in receiving funding. But the second point I want to touch on is really about how we think about and how we categorise this question and issue of women in conflict in the first place. And I think we really have to start thinking about women in conflict as central not just to our development work, but to our foreign policy. And we have such a great track record and reputation to build on, and real live opportunities to make progress, for example, through our work as penholder on women, peace and security at the UN Security Council. But it means, for example, much more of things like encouraging countries to adopt and adhere to international human rights treaties that cover the rights of women in conflict. It means increasing pressure on perpetrators of sexual violence in conflict and external parties that back these perpetrators, including through sanctions where appropriate. It means using the UK's voice at the UN Security Council to continue shining a light on this issue and calling for accountability. It means fully supporting UN fact-finding missions so that evidence is compiled and perpetrators are deterred through that monitoring. And it means, another example, facilitating meaningful participation of diverse groups of survivor-led organisations and women's rights organisations in prevention, conflict prevention and peace-building processes. So I really look forward to seeing our government's continued progress on this important matter. And I believe that those two things, reforming the way we think about funding for women in conflict and elevating women in conflict to be not just a development priority but a diplomatic priority, are the right places to start. Thank you.
Shannon.
Thank you, Sir Jeremy. First of all, a real pleasure to serve under your chairship, and could I thank the Honourable Lady for Norwich North for leading the debate with a passion and with an interest and setting the scene so very well. These are always hard subjects to talk about. I find them incredibly difficult sometimes to comprehend. The violence that is shown towards women and children. I find it unfathomable they understand anybody wants to do that, but across this world they do. And with a violence and brutality that shocks me to the core, and I know shocks everyone else here as well. So thank you for giving us a chance to participate in this debate. This issue is not only a matter of human dignity, but it's also one that demands urgent action from this Parliament and indeed the international community. So it's good to be here to discuss that. Can I first of all just say what a pleasure it is to see the Minister in her place. I look forward to our contribution. I know that the Honourable Lady has the same qualities of compassion and understands things with an honesty that we all try to express in broken words in this chamber today and in the main chamber. And also a pleasure to see the Shadow Minister in her place, and I look forward to her contribution. She and I have been friends for many years. We've participated in these debates alongside, so today I'm very confident that the Shadow Minister will deliver that as well. The Library have sent us some very helpful stats. Some people say, well, stats are stats, but stats illustrate perhaps maybe where the problems are, Sir Jeremy. And I think some of those were shocking for me to read today, or indeed yesterday. 4 out of every 10 people killed in conflict are women, and things in perspective. 117.5 million people displaced, half of them are women. The last year, a 50% increase in sexual violence. And I find it particularly difficult to read the papers and whenever these stories are are very apparent, because the horror that they've experienced, I can never really fathom, but I find it difficult to understand. I remember when the UCD ladies came here a long time ago, must be about 10 years ago, thereabouts. I met some of them ladies, and they had, I almost, to tell you the truth, I almost felt like I was intruding by listening to their stories, because what you probably did unknowingly was you helped them to relive all those horrors that they had been subjected to. But again, it's the world we live in. As chair of the APPG for freedom of religious belief, in particular, I look at how conflict impacts women of different faiths, and I want to maybe, Sir Jeremy, just in my short time of speaking today, to contribute to that, and most importantly, how this impacts their lives on a daily basis, because it does, with a vengeance. Spanning regions with recent conflicts like Ukraine or in Israel, women in particular, some of the horrors of October 7th come to mind. I know I visited Israel on Easter of last year, and we visited some of the camps where the people were brutalised, where women were sexually abused, some of them were burnt, their bodies were burnt to a cinder. These things I find incompatible with life. Certainly the life that I lead is very different from the life of those who carried those out. The one almost always bear a disproportionate burden as they often traverse these dangerous terrains to support their families. A critical perspective must not be overlooked when addressing the issue of unexploded ordnance either, left in the aftermath of war. For example, the alarming reports of increased sexual exploitation and trafficking of Ukrainian refugee women, particularly the young and the vulnerable, highlight, I believe, the critical need for immediate and targeted action. When I was in Israel, I met some people who were involved in groups that addressed or tried to address the issue of sexual violence and attacks upon women and children. And I was made aware from some of those people who were in a delegation similar but from a different country, that children as young as 8-year-old and women as old as 80 were sexually abused by some of the Russian soldiers. I say that not every Russian is a bad Russian, but to see the ones who carried them out, they need to be held accountable for their brutality and their violence and their depravity against young girls of 8-year-old. My goodness me, it's hard to... And pensioners of 80-year-old. Well, you know, as a Christian, of course, I know that there'll be a day of judgment comes and they'll all be held accountable. But I like to see their day of judgment coming quicker in this world if I had my way. I remember visiting, as I did, visit a refugee camp in Poland some years ago, a couple of years ago it was actually, and some of the delegation who were there, we noticed these guys, predatory males I would call them probably, who, you remember the people who were in that camp, refugee camp, just in a matter of months after the attack upon Ukraine by Russia. And these guys were pushing these trolleys around, supposedly collecting laundry and so on. But what we noticed, as not we're smarter than anybody else, we're not smarter, but I do take note of things that happen around me. And some of these people weren't actually doing anything. They were just watching to see what the women and the girls were doing. And it was obvious to me that they were predatory. We made sure when we left that place that we told the police people in charge to ensure that those people, whatever they were doing there, it certainly didn't look like they were there to help anybody. With reports from Germany indicating that only 14% of female refugees are employed, the risk of falling prey to human traffickers has grown, exacerbated by a lack of adequate accommodation and economic support. So I think it's important, and I say this, you know, a busy mind and a busy person can't always be distracted by things that happen around them, so it's important to focus upon that as well. In conflict zones worldwide, the experiences of women and girls are shaped by a convergence of vulnerabilities, by gender, by faith, and socio-economic status. Tragically, these intersecting identities often make them the first and the most enduring victims of violence, of coercion and systematic discrimination. And one of the most harrowing, Sir Jeremy, manifestations of 4 violations in conflict settings is the targeted abduction, forced marriage and conversion of women and girls from religious minority communities. The Honourable Lady, in her introduction, referred to Pakistan. I've been to Pakistan twice, primarily for the issues of freedom of religious belief. But I'd love to say that that the second time I went, 2 years after the first time, that things have changed, but I don't see any change. Indeed, if anything, I see it getting worse. And I'm minded of the case of a 13-year-old girl, 13-year-old, 2 years younger than my oldest grandchild. Her name was Kavita Awad, a Hindu girl abducted and forcibly married. Her family, already financially marginalised, faced threats, violence and theft when they sought justice. Justice for their 13-year-old in a country that seems to think it's okay to marry a Hindu, a Christian, a Sikh, young girl of 13, 14, 12-year-old, off to a predatory male who should never have any say in the issue. This is not, unfortunately, an isolated case, but part of a systematic campaign to raise the religious identity of minority communities. Courts often fail to protect these girls, framing their exploitation as consensual marriages. No, they're not. The mums and dads don't want them married, and whenever they go to the police either fail to act or are unwilling to act. And the courts of the land don't protect them. So I know that the Minister knows these things, by the way. I'm not saying that the Right Honourable Lady doesn't know already, but these things disturb me greatly. And I think, Sir Jeremy, I think we need to have some idea of what these countries are doing to stop this happening. In conflict zones, sexual violence is wielded as a weapon to intimidate and destabilise entire communities. Women and girls are targeted not only for their gender but also for their faith. In Nigeria and Sudan, just to give some examples, where Christian girls and those of ethnic religious minorities find themselves suppressed physically, but also with their human rights, but also with their faith as well. And these things are incredibly difficult to comprehend. Such acts of violence aim to extinguish the cultural and the religious identity of persecuted groups. I did visit again Nigeria some 2 years ago, I think it was, and we had a chance to speak to some of the displaced. The displaced weren't just Christians, the displaced were also Muslims, who also found themselves suppressed because of their religious beliefs equally, and that disturbs me greatly. Again, the Minister I know knows these things, and I would be very pleased if the Minister is able to give us some feedback on it. Women and girls often find themselves doubly marginalised in refugee camps or internally displaced persons settlements, which are the ones we visited in Nigeria. And none of them referred to Sudan. The stories of Sudan are they're absolutely impossible to finish the stories. I read the other day there of a mum who slept there in the house, and 3 of the Sudan soldiers, terrorist groups, whatever they were, broke in and abused that young girl of theirs, and they all slept in the other part of the house and didn't even know about it the next morning. They found that their wee young girl of 13, 14-year-old had been abused by soldiers that night. Sudan. If you haven't read the stories of Sudan, you need to read them. They're absolutely unbelievable. What's happening in that country is one of the worst genocide that I have seen and heard tell of across the world. Not only are they uprooted from their homes, they also face discrimination based on their faith, compounding their vulnerability. The trauma of forced conversions, of violence, of displacement inflicts profound psychosocial harm on the people, coupled with the restricted access to education, which the Honourable Lady referred to as well, and economic opportunities. They need to have something to do. They need to have opportunity as well. These experiences perpetuate cycles of poverty and disenfranchisement amongst minority groups. Some things that I think we should, I always like, well, in the story, which is quite depressing, I have to say, and maybe quite negative, there are pluses, and the pluses are, and I highlight these 3 things, and maybe the Minister could give me some feedback on this. UK government have initiated a PSVI team preventing sexual diseases. It's something that they've done across the world in many parts. I know that they have Ethiopia, Iraq and Ukraine and Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories as well. Government needs to be commended for that. You know, we sit here and we ask government to do things. You know, give credit, Sir Jeremy, where things are done right, and thank you for that. But I think we also need to, if you don't mind me asking, need to be seeing how we can increase that and help more. As the violence, as sexual violence increases, then can I just say very gently, I think we need to, as a government, need to match that from a funding point of view. Can government, again, these are constructive comments, Minister, they're not meant to be critical in any way, it's not my form, it's not how I do things. Government increase the aid that is available, specifically targeting for women and children. And the last thing in that one, which I would love to see, and I think we all would like to see, would be that those who have carried out horrible, depraved, physical, sexual abuse of women and children are made accountable. Because they are stories to tell. Those women and those girls will tell their stories. And those who did it need to be accountable. So let's have that day of reckoning. I know there'll be a day of reckoning as a Christian in the last days of this world, but that day of reckoning, I would like to see that coming in this world sooner. So I conclude, Mr. Chairman, with this. To achieve gender equality and to safeguard freedom of religious belief are not merely aspirational goals, they are moral imperatives. Let us commit to amplifying the voices of women and girls who have suffered in silence for far too long. So I urge the Minister to work in conjunction with her counterparts to ensure that these issues are addressed and that more can be done to protect women facing hardship. My job of us all here is to be that voice for the voices, that voice for those who have no person to speak for them. Today we do that.
Patricia Ferguson.
Jeremy, and I apologise in advance. I'm slightly under the weather today. I've got a bit of a sore throat, so it might not come out quite as I intended to do today. But this is a very important debate, and I'm so grateful to my colleague for securing the debate, because while we often are focused on the issues around conflict and violence and what can be done to resolve them, we can sometimes miss the fact that conflict does disproportionately affect women and girls. During times of conflict, existing inequalities are magnified and exaggerated and lead to further insecurity, to homelessness, and particularly to violence and sexual violence against women and girls. We've heard already today from my honourable friend about the situation in Gaza, which, as we know, is unconscionable at the moment. And it's estimated that almost 50 mothers and their children are killed every day. According to World Health Organization estimates, 183 women give birth every day, and as we've heard, many of those women are enduring C-sections without anaesthesia or other medicines. Ironically, much of the supplies that would be needed to resolve that particular situation are probably sitting at the borders in the convoys that we know have been sent by international agencies and by governments like our own, and they could be put to use. Such desperate need is there that it is really just outrageous that those supplies are not being allowed to get to the people who need them so badly. In Myanmar, women have borne the brunt of the military oppression in that country and have been subjected to a rise in intimate partner violence and sexual violence too. Some 3 million people have been displaced, which in turn puts women at further risk of violence and abuse because they are separated from those who would normally, one would hope, help to defend them, their fathers, their brothers, and their husbands and partners. At the same time, in Myanmar, women are shut out of any discussion, any high-level debate about making peace. And I'll come back to that point a little later, if I may. I was very pleased to read about the ongoing commitment and work of the Minister and of the UK Government in the Preventing Sexual Violence and Conflict initiative, which I understand remains a real priority for our Government. And I look forward, I hope, to the Minister saying a little about that at the end of the debate. Often when it comes to peace building, and hopefully in some of these conflicts we will eventually move to peace building efforts, women are again excluded from those efforts and from those discussions. And that leads to further entrenched disenfranchisement. Women are often the people who hold together communities. They often have a deeper understanding of the whole community needs in humanitarian emergencies particularly. And of course, as we know, in many traditions, they still hold the major caring responsibilities and are very much integrated into their communities. But they're not well resourced or respected as international humanitarian actors. So the commitment of our Government to take forward resolutions to these conflicts is of course very, very welcome, and as we would expect it to be. But I would hope that the Minister could give us some sense of how women will be involved in that work as we go forward. Women being affected by conflict is not a new phenomenon. It is something that has been with us probably for all of humankind. But of course now we know how wrong it is. We know how unacceptable it is. And because of social media and television and all the other media channels we have, we know for ourselves exactly what is going on. So we cannot turn a blind eye to this. And if we don't involve women in resolving conflict, and if we don't involve women in peace-building initiatives, we are destined to repeat the mistakes of the past. Something I suspect that none of us here would wish to do.
Martin. I'd like to congratulate the Honourable Lady for Norwich North on securing this debate, and other members from across the House for their fine speeches. And I think we're going to touch on some of the same themes, such as the gravity of the topic, but also the clarity that we have around what the problems are and also some of the solutions. Mr. Chairman, in 2023, over 600 million women and girls live within 30 miles of conflict, and that figure's 40% higher than it was in 2015. Mr. Chairman, the world is burning, and we've heard from other members, countries like Israel and Gaza, Sudan, Myanmar, Ukraine, Iraq, Syria, Sudan, Congo. I mean, this was just a short list that I managed to sketch out from the small number of speeches that we've already had, but I could fill a 10-minute speech with a list of the areas around the world where violence against women and girls is being inflicted in conflict. As has been already said by many from across the House here, it is women and girls and children who suffer disproportionately in conflict. What you tend to see in conflict is that gender roles become more extreme. Men go to fight. Of course, this is a stereotype, but that is what we're talking about. These stereotypes become more entrenched, that men go to fight and women are often left at home looking after the children and defenceless because the men are fighting elsewhere. And so they become a target and they become a way to inflict pain, not just on those individual women and girls, but on the group at large. Sexual violence in conflict is a military strategy used by actors around the world to defeat or to attempt to defeat their enemies. So I would like to draw on just a couple of examples and then to highlight one solution that costs nothing that I think the British government should push much harder on. So, one of the gravest inflictions of violence upon women and girls is that which is happening currently in Ukraine. And earlier this week I spoke in the main chamber of the House of Commons about the abduction and transfer of Ukrainian children to Russia. But rape and sexual violence is also used as a systematic tool by Russian forces in Ukraine. Indeed, cases have been documented where Russian soldiers have been issued with Viagra in order to facilitate their rape and sexual violence. And the reports that we hear that echo the advance of Russian forces across the country in 2022 are so similar that we know that this is a tactic of war rather than a case of a few bad apples, as is so often claimed by the defenders of these heinous crimes. So in Ukraine, women ranging from 16 to 83 years old have been documented, reported being raped. And this often happens during home incursions. So a home will be searched by Russian troops, and then they will rape the occupants whilst doing so. And one particularly sickening case was verified by the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights. And Russian soldiers entered a family home outside Kyiv in the initial stages of the invasion. And they shot the family dog, Mr. Chairman, before murdering the father. And they then raped the mother for several hours while her 4-year-old hid under a blanket and watched on. And while they were raping the mother, they were drinking, Mr. Chairman. Then they passed out when they were finished, allowing the mother to escape with her 4-year-old son. Furthermore, Mr. Chairman, whilst this has been going on in a systematic fashion, the Russian state has been destroying healthcare facilities in Ukraine. And that obviously has a wide-ranging effect that we know, but specifically when coupled with rape, it takes away the very treatment services that Ukrainian women rely on to offer some solace and care after the brutality and the depravity of rape at the hands of a Russian soldier. These crimes of the Russian state are systematic, and they are an attempt to break the Ukrainian spirit and resolve to resist, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I served several times in Afghanistan as a British officer, and the tragedy that has befallen Afghanistan since 2021, when the Taliban took over, is immense indeed. And that tragedy particularly falls upon Afghan women. Women's rights have been decimated in Afghanistan since the Taliban took over. Indeed, they no longer really exist in any meaningful sense. And it's been extensively documented, and many members from across the House have already commented on what has happened in Afghanistan to Afghan women's rights. So I won't go into it in great detail. Suffice to mention one or two particularly extreme examples. Before the Taliban took over, Afghanistan had a system of support for survivors of gender-based violence, of which there was some, certainly. There were shelters and legal aid and medical services and psychological support, which offered a lifeline to thousands of women. But since the Taliban have taken over, not only have the incidences of rape increased, but also these shelters have been targeted, looted and destroyed to the point at which they are non-existent. So it's the same pattern that we see in Ukraine, not only the crimes, but also the services that are meant to offer comfort and solace and care after the event are destroyed. The Ministry of Women's Affairs and the Human Rights Commission, of course, are no longer extant in Afghanistan under the Taliban. And in one particular egregious example that I will just finish on when talking about Afghanistan was actually reported by the Guardian newspaper. And in July, there was a video disseminated on social media of the Taliban raping a female human rights activist at gunpoint in a Taliban prison. And we should ask ourselves why this video was filmed and disseminated, Mr. Chairman. And it was actually not just it was not just that women must be violated in Afghanistan, but they must also be shamed and humiliated to make the point. And particularly in Afghanistan, this is particularly poignant with the cultural history of Afghanistan, that not only will, if you stand up for women's rights, will you be violated, but your family's name will be shamed through your violation on social media. Mr. Chairman, these crimes are beyond depraved. So I have, in conclusion, I've spoken of conflict and I've spoken of post-conflict, if that is indeed what we can call what is happening in Afghanistan. And now I'd like to talk of peace, because it is only through peaceful, stable societies that women and girls and boys and men can be safe. Peace must be our policy, Mr. Chairman. Peace must be our goal. And as many members have mentioned already, it is a fact that if you have a peace agreement where women are involved in negotiating that agreement, that peace lasts longer. And by definition, if that peace lasts longer, that means that more women and girls and boys and men will be safe. And so it must be the policy of the British government to insist, not to urge, but to insist that where peace negotiations are happening under the auspices of the United Nations or the African Union or the OSCE or any other body with which we are involved or affiliated, women must be fully represented in those negotiations. This is not just a moral point, it is a deeply practical point, and it is the one thing we can do in an age of constricted government budgets that is free and will have a definite practical outcome. Mr. Chairman, it is crucial that the UK does this. It is crucial that we insist that women are involved in negotiating peace agreements. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sir Jeremy. Can I foremost place on record my thanks to the member for Norwich North for securing this very important debate today. We know that conflict is on the rise across the world, and that with each conflict comes an increased level of vulnerability and violence for women and girls. Any discussion around conflict, therefore, must be conducted through a gendered lens, and I think today provides the opportunity for just that. And so can I again thank my honourable friend for giving us all the opportunity today to shine a light on this ongoing issue. There is, of course, an array of impacts that conflict has on women and girls, many covered by colleagues today already. However, today I will focus my remarks on one hugely important yet understudied problem, the impact of sexual violence and conflict on women and girls. Too often, sexual violence against women and girls is swept under the rug and its victims forgotten, ignored or denied. Today is an opportunity to recognise and acknowledge that it is real, it is a problem, and that we need to take it seriously across the world in order to end it. This is an area which I've campaigned on for a number of years, and I'd like to recognise how encouraging it is that so many new colleagues are here taking part today. Actually, the new colleagues are in the majority here, which is great to see. Also, already today, we've heard about the impact on women and girls in so many countries, including Congo, Sudan, Middle East, Afghanistan, Nigeria, Myanmar, Ukraine, Iraq, and probably many more that I have missed or will be talked about following my remarks today. But in my remarks today, I'd like to focus on the terrible war, in particular in Israel and Gaza. In particular, the sexual violence against Israeli women and girls committed by Hamas on 7th of October 23, and the sexual violence against Palestinian women and girls since. As many of the victims on October the 7th were murdered or died from their wounds, we may never have an exact picture of what happened in that murderous attack. What we do know is that Hamas's violence against Israeli women was a well-documented case of mass and organised sexual violence, not least because the perpetrators proudly filmed, advertised and celebrated their crimes. One account from a first responder at Kibbutz Be'eri reported piles and piles of dead women who were, and I quote, completely naked from the waist down, as well as horrific sexual mutilation. Rami Shmuel, an organiser of the Supernova Music Festival and witness of the massacre in which 360 mostly Israelis were murdered, saw female victims with no clothes as he escaped, and he said, and I quote, "Their legs were spread out and some of them were butchered," end quote. Another Supernova survivor, Yoni Sadan, reported seeing, and I quote, 8 or 10 of the fighters beating and raping one woman. And I quote, "When they finished, they were laughing and the last one shot her in the head," end quote. These were not random acts, but a systematic effort that women's rights campaigner, Professor Ruth Halperin Kadari, has characterised, and I quote, premeditated plan to use sexual violence as a weapon of war. We must also take a moment to recognise that Hamas's sexual violence may even be ongoing. Around 100, it may just be under that now according to last night's news. So, just under 100 Israelis remain held hostage in Gaza, of whom 12 we know are women and girls. Reports have indicated and survivors have confirmed that both female and male hostages have been subjected to sexual assault in their 424 days in captivity. Likewise, I remain gravely concerned about the sexual violence against Palestinian women and girls that they have too endured and continue to endure today in this ongoing conflict. Credible reports from UN experts highlight that Palestinian women and girls in detention have been subject to multiple forms of sexual assault. This includes being stripped naked and searched by male Israeli officers. Photos of these vulnerable Palestinian women in degrading circumstances have also reportedly been taken and uploaded online by members of the Israeli army. Reem Al-Salam, the UN Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women and Girls, argued that all these numbers are in fact likely to be even higher due to the secrecy in which the assaults take place and the stigma around reporting sexual violence and rape, which discourages women from speaking out, something that exists wherever you are in the world. Because wherever you are, we, as both parliamentarians and as human beings, should be saying, if you are a victim of sexual violence, we believe you. But all too often, victims face scepticism and even outright denial. The Israeli women and girls subjected to sexual violence on 7th of October 23 were met with deafening silence from many agencies and organisations founded to support victims. Many organisations initially ignored, minimised or even cast doubt that Hamas's sexual violent crimes had even taken place. UN Women issued multiple statements following 7th of October, none of which made reference to the sexual violence of that day. The UN Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women and Girls blandly expressed, and I quote, concern about reports of sexual violence that may have occurred since October 7th, committed by state and non-state actors against Israelis and Palestinians. Worse, many supposed feminists dismissed discussion of Hamas's rape as colonial feminism and unverified accusations. the latter of which will be all too familiar to those victims brave enough to report their experiences, whether in conflict zones, but actually even non-conflict zones. This is all too true, we know, for most victims of sexual violence, sadly. We know that sexual violence is perpetuated by stigma, silence, victim blaming and denial. All of these prevent women and girls getting the justice that they deserve. When we deny the reality of sexual violence, we perpetuate it. So it's incumbent on us all to ensure we treat victims, all victims of sexual violence, with the respect and the compassion that they deserve. Wherever you are, whoever you are, we believe you. Thank you.
Emily Dyte.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the member for Norwich North for organising this debate, and thank you to the Minister, who I know feels very, very strongly and has done for many years on these issues. I'll try and refrain my remarks from repeating anything that's been said by other honourable members, because they have been some fantastic speeches. I would also just like to say to anybody that's watching, if they feel disturbed by this, there are support services that they can refer to, because this is a difficult but important that we shine light on it, and I know there's some detail here that can be triggering to some people. The world is facing the highest number of conflicts since World War II, and women and girls are paying the price. Upholding the safety and dignity of women and girls, protecting them from torture and violence, is a human rights obligation. But it's one that the world and we often fall short of upholding. Rape in war is by no means a new phenomenon, but it's an escalation of a deliberate strategic and political tactic that is now undeniable. And this has many consequences. There are the physical consequences, the unwanted pregnancies and the STDs and HIV, but there is also the brutality and the psychological consequences that come alongside these kinds of activities. And in conflict areas, what makes it worse is the disregard of international law, the arms proliferation, and the increasing militarisation and the shrinking of that civic space. And it exacerbates conflict-related sexual violence, and it hinders safe reporting and response. It also leads to an increase in trafficking and exploitation. The access to healthcare is just one of the ways gender violence gets perpetrated. Some by the lack of care for those who have been physically damaged by rape, but also those who have unwanted pregnancies as a result. Hospitals and other healthcare facilities should be a beacon of safety and healing for those that are injured in conflict, including survivors of sexual violence. But the destruction of health facilities, the direct and indirect killing of healthcare workers, has severely hindered the provision of life-saving medical assistance for survivors who need comprehensive medical care, sexual and reproductive health care, psychological support, as well as avenues of reporting. The message from the Me Too movement was that crimes of sexual violence are compounded by cultures of stigma, silence, denial and victim blaming, which often prevent women securing justice. Yet, it feels like too often this is ignored when the women are in a war zone. Women and girls are just seen as inevitable collateral damage. I'd like to highlight a few cases, and again, as I said, I will try not to repeat what has been said before by honourable members. In Gaza, beyond the impact of the loss of hospitals, healthcare officials that has been highlighted by honourable friends, women and children also bear the brunt of the lack of supplies in wartime. In Gaza, millions of women and children are suffering from the inability of aid agencies to cope with the demand for supplies and their inability to deliver them to those in need. At the moment, we estimate there are 690,000 women and girls in Gaza that require menstrual hygiene products. The stocks of hygiene kits have run out, and the prices of those that are available are exorbitant. Women are having to choose between buying pads and buying food and water. So instead, they are cutting up old sheets, old clothes, to use as pads, thereby increasing their risk of infection and the stigma that those infections bring. There's also a risk because they have not changed their clothes in over 40 days. There are also the fact that in every humanitarian disaster, in every sense of the word, women pay the biggest price. The UN are working with over 30 women-led organisations in Gaza to provide gender-based violence services. And last year, over 159,000 women and girls used these services in Gaza. I dread to think that if the ban on UNRWA comes in, where those women and girls will go for support. In Afghanistan, which we've heard a lot about, it is absolutely the Taliban's apartheid of women. They've denied women and girls access to learning, to employment, to travelling, to exclude them from public spaces and banning them, and I find this one the hardest to understand, to ban them from singing. From singing. They may not want to sing, but they have been banned from singing and banned from attending any medical institutions while banning them from seeing male doctors. Despite these restrictions, Afghan girls, many of who were already in school when the Taliban returned to power in 2021, continue to dream. But they have to find themselves attending underground schools, participating in local homeschooling or remote learning, which actually puts them and their teachers at risk. Other consequences is child marriage has increased by 25%. Child marriage. And we're not even talking about forced marriage, which is bad enough. Child marriage. These children should not be forced into a marriage and everything that comes with that. And the risk of maternal mortality has surged by 50%. In Israel, as we've just heard from the Right Honourable Member, rape was used as a weapon. Now, I don't want to repeat what was said, but what I do want to say is despite the fact that it's been well documented, even by the own perpetrators, the majority of organisations still fail to acknowledge the sexual violence that took place on the 7th of October. In the Ukraine, we've heard about the rapes that are happening. And it's not just the rapes, it's the fear of rapes. One Ukrainian victim of sexual violence said, "I would have preferred to die." Rape has become cheaper than bullets in order to terrorize a nation, and these aggressors know that. The psychological fear is passed on not just from woman to woman, but from women to girls. And this excuse me, and the civilian women who are not officers and soldiers are often targeted for rape and punishment to humiliate the soldiers on the front line. So in conclusion, time and time again, women bear the brunt of war's brutality. They are consistently on the front line as soldiers, as fighters, as doctors, as nurses, as volunteers, as peace activists, as carers for their communities and families, as internally displaced people and refugees, and too often as victims and survivors. Women confront the increased sexual and gender-based violence and its perilous health conditions while being forced to make life and death decisions for themselves and for their family. And at the same time, women are often excluded from the decision-making processes, and their rights and needs remain unprotected and unmet. Yet gender-based, this continuing culture of silence continues even though the UN officially recognised gender-based violence in 1992. Now, some of us, that doesn't feel very long ago, and that shows our age. It's as recently as that. But even since that recognition, little has changed for women in conflict areas. There's still too much silence from international organisations, alongside a lack of moral clarity in calling out sexual violence on a global scale. Justice begins with recognition, and any hope of healing begins with recognition. If we are going to be a rules-based society and believe in human rights, we cannot continue to see women and girls as inevitable collateral in a conflict. We are not just victims of violence or weapons of war. So, what can we do? We must work with authorities, especially security forces, to reinforce the message that sexual violence, like all war crimes, is prohibited and will be prosecuted. We have to draw a clear red line against these acts. Training, awareness raising, a prompt response from those in positions of leadership in military and police units is a necessity to make this happen. A cultural shift from the normalisation of sexual violence and emotional battery of women, of girls in conflict, so they are seen as the true victims and survivors they are, and pressure on international authorities to take a concerted action to make protection from sexual violence a central part of their peacekeeping efforts. And finally, making our UK contribution a long-term partnership with women and women-led organisations right around the world so that we can support those women in those countries to be part of a future free of gender-based violence. Thank you.
Ellie Chowns.
Jeremy, it's a pleasure to speak under your chairship, and I'd like to pay tribute to the Honourable Member for Norwich North for securing this debate on such an important topic, and indeed to all the colleagues who have spoken this afternoon so eloquently and so passionately on this topic. We've heard devastating statistics about the impact of conflict on women and girls. We've heard testimony about the importance of sexual violence as a weapon of war, and listening to what the Honourable Member was saying there, I was really reminded so strongly of the words of Giselle Pellicot that shame must change sides, and I think that is absolutely key to bear in mind. I was also reflecting during the speeches that members have made about the fact that the impact of conflict on women and girls, the impact of violence, conflict-related violence on women and girls, isn't just something that is perpetrated by soldiers in uniforms with guns. We know that in the context of conflict, and indeed post-conflict, there's an increase in domestic violence against women and girls. The inequalities, the injustices are writ large through societies, and that's why it's so important that we do have this debate today. This is an issue of very personal interest and concern for me. Before I came to this place, I worked for many years in the field of international development, including in northern Uganda during a time of conflict. And so I've been reflecting here and thinking today of the women that I knew and worked alongside there during that period. I've also worked with the Ecumenical Accompaniment Programme in Palestine and Israel that works for peace in that conflict. I was thinking of the women in Gulu in northern Uganda that I used to work with from People's Voice for Peace, and the role that they played, local women supporting, you know, their fellow community members, women in their communities who had been affected by sexual violence, by displacement, by theft, by violence, by the complete loss of livelihoods and lives of loved ones, and the work that was done by those within those communities to support their sisters to endure through extremely difficult conditions. And in thinking about the remarks that I wanted to make today, so I thought of these women, I thought of women in Gaza, in Israel, women in conflict all around the world, refugee women that I know in the UK, who are the lucky ones who have escaped from situations like this, women I know from Iran, from the Ukraine, who I think I hope would support the remarks that I'm going to make and the suggestions and requests to the Minister. And I think it's just so important that in debating these topics, it is those women's voices that we have at the centre of our thinking and our discussions. And so I think there are 4 points that I'd like to ask the Minister to respond to in her remarks, if she's able to, or sort of 4 key asks, really, key lessons in reflecting on this topic. The first is, and I think we are agreed in this room on this, you know, the UK government must do everything to defend, to protect, to uphold the rights of women and girls in all of our international interactions, as we should in all of our domestic work too. I'm sure that is difficult and complicated diplomatically sometimes, but it must be absolutely at the forefront and explicit in all of that work that we do. The second point that I'd like to make, and in this I'm echoing the call of the Honourable Member for Norwich North and others here today, we must reverse the cuts in UK aid. The cuts that were made under the previous Conservative government were, in my view, shameful. It is incumbent on the new government to reverse those cuts as quickly as possible. I know, personally, I know from friends and colleagues how devastating those cuts were, and I was interested to read in one of the briefings that I read prior to this debate from Women for Women International, that in a very large-scale survey they did, only 25% of women in conflict situations had received any aid at all. In Afghanistan, it was less than 10%. You know, the quantity of aid really does matter. Aid is not the only solution to alleviating the impact of conflict on women and girls, but it is one of the things that we as the UK can do. But my third point is that it's not just the quantity but the quality of that aid, and it's absolutely essential that all conflict response, all humanitarian response explicitly considers the needs, the rights of women and girls in framing that response, because as the Honourable Member just mentioned, women and girls do have specific needs, whether that's for sexual and reproductive health in particular, and particularly need for protection against violence. I'm personally a big fan of the use of cash transfers in humanitarian aid, and again, bearing women's rights in mind when distributing aid is crucial, and cash transfers, I would argue, can be one way to really empower women in a conflict response situation. The second aspect of that, I think, is that we really need to ensure that our aid programme gives core funding, long-term core funding to women's rights organisations, women-led organisations. Having worked myself in the international development sector, I can see colleagues nodding strongly here. I'm sure they completely agree with what I'm going to say. The importance of long-term funding for organisations that are working to address conflict is absolutely crucial. I think we all know, as members of Parliament, as people who've worked in public services, the difficulty of doing things in a hand-to-mouth basis on a year-on-year basis. It's so important to have long-term core funding to build the capacity, particularly of women's organisations, women's-led organisations, to challenge the inequalities and the injustices that they have faced often for decades, in order to uplift their voices. Because that's my fourth and final point. When we're thinking about conflict resolution, which is the way that, the only long-term way to get away from the disastrous stats that have been cited so far. Indeed, not just resolution of existing conflicts, but prevention of potential conflicts. Amplifying women's voices, creating space for women's voices and women's participation, as the Honourable Member here emphasised earlier as well, is absolutely essential. Unless the voices of women and girls are heard and are heeded in peace building and in conflict resolution, we won't be able to tackle the problems we've been discussing today. Thank you.
Justine Sullivan.
Thank you very much, Sir Jeremy, and it's a pleasure to serve under your chairship today. I'd also like to congratulate my honourable friend for securing this really critical and timely debate, and also to everyone who has contributed. It has been incredibly moving hearing the very, what I believe to be very personal accounts of what people have viewed and what people have witnessed. The honourable member spoke very powerfully about the rape, the brutal rape of women in Ukraine, the abomination of the kidnap of children. And we've also heard, again from honourable friend, about the attempt by the Taliban to extinguish any and all joy from the life of Afghan women. In fact, to extinguish the women, full stop. As we've already heard, in war zones across the globe, the existing inequalities that women and girls face on a daily basis in peacetime, they're magnified, and they're making them more vulnerable to violence, exploitation, displacement and insecurity. But that vulnerability is not inevitable. It is the result of deep-seated gender inequalities that shape societies. And it's our responsibility to challenge and dismantle these structures, especially in times of crisis. Conflict amplifies the risks that women and girls endure, and we know, as we've heard today from organisations like ActionAid and Plan International, that wars lead to surges in intimate partner violence, limited access to sexual and reproductive health care, and heightened caregiving burdens for women due to conscription and displacement. Again, these impacts are structural, they're not incidental, and they exacerbate inequalities that persist long after conflict ends. But despite bearing the brunt of these hardships, women are often excluded from the very processes that shape their futures, from humanitarian relief efforts to peace-building negotiations. Women's voices are ignored, their expertise is undervalued, and their leadership opportunities are denied. And this marginalisation, it's not only unjust, but it's counterproductive, because these are the women and the organisations, the women-led local organisations that possess invaluable insights into the needs of their communities, and they are best positioned to deliver targeted and effective solutions, yet they're underfunded and underrepresented in international efforts. These organisations ensure that humanitarian responses address the specific needs of women and girls, providing life-saving supplies and essential services such as mental health support, sexual and reproductive health care, and psychosocial aid. By centring women's leadership, we can not only address immediate needs, but also catalyse long-term equitable change. And we've already heard some really stark examples of the gendered impact of conflict from specific areas today. And as my honourable friend, the member for Washington Gateshead South mentioned, rape was used as a tool of terrorism on October the 7th. And that was compounded by so many people who knew better, ignoring, downplaying those atrocities, and just adding yet another injustice to those women who suffered. And again, in Gaza, nearly 50 mothers and their children are killed every single day, according to the United Nations Women. Displaced Palestinian women are facing extreme emotional tolls, increased risks of gender-based violence and lack of access to essential health care. I have 3 children. I cannot imagine waking up every morning with the same horrors unfolding every single day, not able to protect my children, not able to give them shelter, not able to give them water, food, not able to take care of their basic health needs. And they're having to play this out every single day, every single night. The World Health Organisation reports, as the member for Glasgow West said, that 183 women give birth daily in Gaza, many undergoing caesareans without any anaesthesia due to restrictions in medical supplies. And this place has also heard testimony from medical professionals who are volunteering in Gaza, and they're operating under the most horrific conditions without the most basic medical supplies that they need. And we also heard about the women in Myanmar who are facing brutal repression, including sexual violence and intimate partner violence, as the military targets women activists and peace builders. And economic instability and food insecurity have led to a rise in early marriages, and the displacement of nearly 3 million people has left women and girls at heightened risk of abuse. Despite these challenges, women are systematically excluded from political and peace negotiation spaces. And whilst talking and about these injustices and brutalities, hearing about the horrors that are taking place all over the world, it can really lead us to a place of despair. But we must have hope, because we are not just bystanders watching. We have a part to play in this. The UK must take bold and consistent action to address these injustices. As a signatory to the Grand Bargain 2.0, the UK is committed to directing 25% of humanitarian funding to local actors, including women's rights organisations. Yet in 2021, only 0.2% of UK humanitarian funding went to these groups, and that's just not acceptable. We must consider ring-fencing funds for women's rights organisations within our humanitarian spending. I think a lot of what I was going to go on to say has already been covered, but what I will say is that in addressing these challenges, we have to have a coherent approach to conflict prevention, peace building and humanitarian aid. All UK-funded programmes must incorporate gender analysis and centre the voices of women and girls at every single stage, from policy design to implementation and evaluation. It's not only a moral imperative but a strategic one. As a few of the honourable members have said here today, evidence shows that when women are involved in peace building, agreements are more durable, communities are more resilient and outcomes are more equitable. And the UK Government must continue to be vocal and definitive in its support for international law and in its condemnation of all violation and abuses, particularly those against women and children. All of us across this House are incredibly privileged to have the opportunity to serve our constituents, but our collective power, our influence and our voice stretches far beyond these aisles. And none of us know how long we will serve in this place. But each one of us must make our time in here count. We have to lead with integrity, with compassion and determination to support, protect and amplify women's voices and their rights here and across the world.
I'm Rushworth.
Thank you. I thank everyone who's spoken today as well. I've been very moved, and some of you have given told quite harrowing accounts, really, of the way that women are affected by conflict around the world. Some of that's brought back some difficult memories as well of my previous life before being in this place, when I worked in conflict zones, predominantly with children and also women. And echoing what my honourable friends just said, I've found that I've reflected almost every day since coming here on whether I'm having more impact being here than I did before. And I certainly hope, and I note that there's 5 parties in the room today, and I feel that there's also a huge consensus, and I certainly hope that beyond this room today, that there can be actions. I want to particularly thank the Honourable Member for Norwich North for bringing this really important debate, and also the Minister for being here. And I, until she appeared before the International Development Committee last week, I was a sceptic really on the dual role of both being Women's Inequalities Minister and International Development, and I wondered if it didn't dilute the two, but the answer that she gave us has persuaded me actually that this is it's a very powerful thing to have her on the global stage, because we all know how integral women and girls are to international development. I've reflected as well, many people have raised Afghanistan, and I reflected on a time a few years ago. I was an FE teacher and I had an Afghan student, and she was a remarkable young woman on an access course, and her ambition was to go on to be a doctor, but during that period the Home Office was trying to deport her family back to Afghanistan because it was deemed a safe country. And I remember spending time with her, and she tearfully explained to me that although she probably could live there, she would not be able to continue her studies, and she had this dream of going on to be a doctor. We were ultimately unsuccessful in keeping her in the country, and I don't know what's happened to her since. But I just think that that's a really important point that we note for future policy making in that area. I wanted to just focus my remarks today on the role of women in upstream prevention, including through some examples of some really heroic women that I've been privileged to know. I'll start with a couple of years ago. I was privileged to work actually with the previous government's envoy on freedom of religion or belief in organising the global ministerial, and I was part of an effort to bring women and youth from countries where there is interfaith conflict and bring them to the UK. And one of those was Dishani Jayawira, who is a peace builder in Sri Lanka, and she founded the Centre for Peace Building and Reconciliation. She told us of a story of during the war when she met a man named Ulama, who came to one of her workshops. So she would run workshops that would bring people from different sides of the conflict together to help to build empathy and understanding. On the third day of the workshop, he took her hand and he broke down crying and confessed that he'd been sent by an extremist group to spy on her organisation. But as he spent time in the workshop, he realised the value of its mission. He ended up becoming one of its most committed members and went on to found a school for girls and start his own organisation. We also put here Badung Charity Edu, who's a Nigerian human rights activist. Now, Charity witnessed severe violence in her community, including Muslim houses being burned to ashes around her. Some of her friends were murdered, and beginning at the age of 5, she was repeatedly raped by relatives and close friends. And due to the high standing of her abusers within her community and faith group, she remained silent in her suffering. She faced constant verbal abuse and was often called born by mistake because she was born out of wedlock. She didn't learn to read or write until she was 9 years old and was often bullied at school for being illiterate. Eventually, she found somebody in who she was able to confide and open up, and she talked to her foster parents about her experiences. And today, Charity works mentoring young girls overcoming the trauma of abuse and sexual violence in her country. And she came here to Parliament and spoke eloquently about her work. Another was Khalida from Iraq and her friend Shno Quain Qatada. Now, Khalida is a Yazidi young woman. Shno is a Muslim young woman. And they work together to promote peace in their communities and bore powerful testimony of their work. Another example is Gadir Hani, Israeli-Palestinian, and Sarali Rose, a Jewish Israeli, two women working together for peace. And we took them to Birmingham Central Mosque for a discussion on peace and the role of women in peace there. Gadir was given a pretty hard time, I have to say, but by some of the audience who could not understand why she was appearing on a platform with her Jewish friend, promoting peace in their community. Another example of 3 outstanding women who I was not able to bring to the UK because, unfortunately, we were not successful in getting visas for them to come to the conference, are 3 women in the Central African Republic. And a few years ago, I was with them in Bangui. It by chance happened to be International Women's Day. They are Marie-Thérèse, Aisha Baba and Clarice Manahu, a Catholic, a Protestant and a Muslim. 3 women who represent an interfaith platform and work together. There are 3 male faith leaders of that platform who have also done remarkable work and been nominated for all the Nobel Prizes and things that you would expect and have travelled the world, but we were not able to get visas for the women due to their poverty. And as I sat with these women and asked them about their experience and what I could do, 2 things stood out to me. One of them was the quote. She explained that she was grateful for the work of the men in peace building, but she said, but I was the one who faced down the barrel of a gun and stood between the militia and my community and persuaded them to put down their weapons. Yeah.
I thank him for giving way, and I'd just like to add another example to the great list of examples that he's giving. In Somali culture, and as he knows, Somalia and Somaliland and the other Somali countries are organised by clan, and in Somali culture it's actually Somali women who broker peace between clans. When there's conflicts over grazing rights, it is the women who cross clan lines in order to broker peace.
Thank you for that example. Thank you. And another example, not from my life, but is in Liberia, where women became so fed up of conflict that women on all sides decided to unite behind a woman in Ellen Johnson Sirleaf for the presidency, while many of the men in the country voted along factional lines. And this experience with these women will never leave me. I confess I didn't understand the currency I was using, and I asked if they needed some lunch. I felt we'd been talking for a long time, and I gave them what actually amounted to about $100, thinking I was giving them about $10, and which they looked a bit overwhelmed about. And my translator told me afterwards, though, that when they went off, he said they didn't buy lunch. They came back hungry, because they said that they could use that money better to benefit the community. And when I asked them what would make the biggest difference for them, I was expecting them to make quite big financial demands. They said, could we have some sewing machines? Because a lot of the women have had their husbands killed, they were raped, their homes were burnt and looted, and they no longer have sewing machines to make a living. And for the sake of a few $1,000s, to provide these sewing machines for these women, we could provide a livelihood. And that, frankly, is what we'd probably spend on having a 4x4 on the road for a day in one of those countries. So to echo the point that the Honourable Member for North Herefordshire made about cash transfers, nothing is more important than getting the cash to the women on the ground who know how to spend it to make a real difference in people's lives. Just in conclusion, there's been some outstanding recommendations made today by several members, so I'm not going to repeat them all, but I really do want to emphasise this point about upstream prevention. The previous government rightly established that there needs to be an atrocity prevention strategy within aid spending, but we need now to really take that forward, and part of that has to look at civil society and upstream funding and that long-term support for women's and youth organisations that are doing such vital work in peace building. And we do indeed need to look at the quality of aid and not just the quantity of aid. And I'll close my remarks there because I'm really conscious of time. Just again, an appeal really that we don't just hear words in this room today, but that something leads to action. Thank you.
Move on to the front benches. First of all, for the Lib Dems, Monica Harding.
Thank
Thank you, Chair. It is a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, and may I thank the member for Norwich North for organising this incredibly important debate and the many insightful and inspiring comments we have heard today. We have heard today that women and girls are disproportionately suffering the impacts of the global rising conflicts around the world, forcing record numbers of women and girls to flee their homes and dramatically increasing their vulnerability to sex trafficking, child marriage and other forms of gender-based violence, and then are often marginalised and stigmatised by their communities. But conflict isn't impacting women through gender-based violence alone. It brings with them the loss of livelihoods, worsening healthcare, higher death rates, and undermines women's ability to give birth safely and interrupts access to essential supplies such as contraceptives. We've also seen brazen assaults on civilians, aid workers, and critical service delivery points, all of which constitute flagrant violations of international humanitarian law. Essential infrastructure like hospitals, displacement camps, and safe spaces have also been casualties of war, which has cut women and girls off from vital services and emergency assistance at a time when they are most at risk. As a result, conflict increases existing structural and gender inequalities and takes decades to undo. Time and again, it is women and girls who bear the brunt of the increasing number of armed conflicts globally. And the last year has been a devastating example of this. Let me only touch on the current crises in Sudan and Gaza. I will be brief because this has been covered so much already in this debate. In Gaza, nearly 70% of those killed in Gaza over a 6-month period were women and children. In itself, a terrible statistic, but even then, a disproportionately high level compared to usual conflicts. Pregnant women living through the conflict in Gaza are also 3 times more likely to miscarry, and if they do carry their babies to full term, they are 3 times more likely to die in childbirth due to a lack of access to medical care and nutrition. We also know that women and girls eat less and last in these conflicts, already plagued by malnutrition and starvation, although their nutritional needs are greater. And yet none of the UK's humanitarian funding for Gaza since October 2023 has been ring-fenced for women's needs or for women's rights and women-led organisations. This has to change. In Sudan, since the start of the conflict in April 2023, the number of people in need of sexual and reproductive health services has more than doubled, yet only 6.7% of the funding needed for gender-based violence prevention and response has been provided. Neither Palestine or Sudan have been included in the UK National Action Plan for Women, Peace and Security, and I look forward to hearing from the Minister in her response on why this is. We have heard from members today harrowing accounts of sexual violence in both Gaza and Sudan, and I will only make one note in addition to this, is that in Sudan we hear about women that have taken their own lives to escape rape by paramilitaries or because of being raped, or have experienced sexual violence in order to protect their children from being inflicted. This is the shocking nature of these conflicts. Through the Preventing Sexual Violence in Conflict strategy, the UK has been able to provide important support to survivors in Ukraine, providing expertise and material support to document sexual and gender-based violence, including through the Atrocity Crimes Advisory Group, but NGOs are unclear whether the lessons learned from that critical work are being applied to the conflicts we see in Sudan and Palestine. And so I would be grateful to receive confirmation from the Minister whether the Atrocity Crimes Advisory Groups have been dispatched to Sudan and Gaza, and if they're not, why not? I'd also like to hear from the Minister the Government's plans to pick up on the commitments made by the previous government through the Preventing Sexual Violence in Conflict initiative, so the UK can once again demonstrate global leadership on tackling sexual violence in conflict. Because when we consider how vulnerable and targeted women are in these conflicts, it not only offends our morals and consciences, but it makes, as honourable members have said, absolutely no rational sense either. In Gaza, for instance, women make up 70% of frontline health workers and 60% of caregivers. Women are important advocates, as we have heard, in conflict-torn places, and women are critical to build in lasting peace with strong evidence demonstrating that the involvement of women and girls in peace building is key to ending conflict and building long-term sustainable peace and stability. And I endorse my honourable friend from Tunbridge Wells' eminently sensible and practical suggestion to give women a seat at the table. Women must always have a seat at the table, and there are many women at these tables today. In 2021, only 0.2% of UK humanitarian ODA went to frontline women's rights organisations and movements. And so I asked the Minister to commit funding for women's rights organisation that is ring-fenced with humanitarian spending. As a signatory to the UN Security Council resolution on women, peace and security, the UK must lead on this issue. And the UK must be vocal, clear and more consistent in its support for international humanitarian law and in its condemnation of all violations and abuses against all civilians, including women and girls. My last point is one that I hope the Minister not just agrees with, but acts upon. As the member for North Herefordshire has pointed out, increasing international development funding is the fundamental way the UK government can be properly tackling the kind of gender-based inequality and sexual violence we've been discussing today. Because by prioritising development funding before a conflict breaks out and allowing programmes to tackle existing gender inequalities in peacetime is a far more effective way of tackling deep-rooted inequalities that women and girls often experience in these fragile states and can reduce some of the gendered impacts and violence when conflict breaks out. Because gender-based violence is not inevitable, rather, it is rooted in existing inequalities. But UK aid for programmes which included gender equality objectives nearly halved between 2019 and 2021, with a devastating impact on women and girls. Funding for programmes supporting women and girls desperately needs to be restored immediately, as does the Humanitarian Relief Reserve Fund and health programmes, which have also been cut. All of these programmes have been eroded in the years since UK ODA was cut from 0.7% of GNI to 0.58% by the previous government, but cut further to 0.5% in this government's budget. It is no secret that the Liberal Democrats are pushing hard for the return of 0.7% of GNI and remain perplexed why this government insists on adopting fiscal tests they so vigorously opposed as a shadow government. The point about the 0.7 is that it is proportionate to a country's prosperity. So will the government to commit to reviewing its use of fiscal tests and its declared goal to return to the 0.7%? I'd like to close with this. Women and girls generally do not start wars, nor do they usually have the power to end them, but they suffer disproportionately from them. But it is within our gift to empower them. Let us then commit to do that.
Official Opposition, Wendy Morgan.
Thank you, Mr Betson. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship today. And let me also start by congratulating the member for Norwich North for securing this debate today. I believe it was through the Backbench Business Committee too. So thank you to her for her endeavours. As we've seen today, it has been a very far-reaching debate with many excellent contributions. And also, it's been an excellent opportunity to really highlight the plight of women and girls and to listen to so many testimonies and personal experiences and to share those stories. I think often to hear of things that to most of us in here, let's be honest, would be absolutely unimaginable. So I congratulate her. We are, of course, deeply concerned about the impact that conflict has on women and girls. In particular, reports of conflict-related sexual violence, or CRSV, and its use as a weapon of war, and these are particularly horrifying. We unequivocally condemn such abuses and do not accept them as inevitable consequences of war. During our time in government, Mr Betts, we were at the heart of the international response to CRSV. Since launching the Preventing Sexual Violence in Conflict initiative at PSVI in 2012, we have continued to lead the world in addressing these crimes. In 2022, we hosted an international conference on the issue and launched a political declaration outlining a clear message that sexual violence must end and the steps that were required. This was backed up by £12.5 million in new funding. In 2023, we chaired a meeting of the International Alliance on Preventing Sexual Violence in Conflict, the first of its kind that brought diverse actors together to drive global action. Given the leadership that we showed through PSVI, I am pleased to note that the government put on record a recommitment to the UK's support of the initiative. And I note Lord Collins' appointment as the Prime Minister's Special Representative. I would, however, like to ask what specific plans the Minister has to build on the work that we did through the PSVI. And so can the Minister today also assure colleagues that representations will be made to the Chief Secretary to the Treasury on the value of this initiative ahead of the spending review? Tackling the issues affecting women and girls in conflict is not just limited to ending sexual violence. We must also raise the eyes of women and girls to a brighter future worldwide. As part of this work to advance gender equality and challenge discrimination, we launched the International Women and Girls Strategy for 2023 to 2030. This put women and girls at the heart of the FCDO's work and our investment, and together with partners led to more girls in school, fewer girls forced into early marriage, and more women in high political office and leadership positions. We continued our support for the 3 E's: education, empowering women and girls and championing their health and rights, and ending violence. We made significant progress, and let me say the government has got a lot to live up to. So can I ask what the Minister plans to do to advance these commitments, in particular on each of the 3 E's? One of these is, of course, ending violence, so I would like to touch on some of the specific conflicts we are seeing around the world. And of course, there are many, we've heard examples today. But let me mention Ukraine. In Ukraine, there is concerning evidence of conflict-related sexual violence being committed by Russian forces against Ukrainian civilians and prisoners of war. Some Russian perpetrators have already been convicted for these crimes, and there appears to be a pattern of sexual violence being used as a weapon of war. As part of our work when in government on PSVI, we helped to build investigatory capacity to support accountability in Ukraine. So I'd be grateful to the Minister today if she could update us on the steps that she has taken to build capacity in Ukraine to help ensure Russian perpetrators are brought to justice. In Sudan, we are seeing a war driven by a man-made power struggle that has led to a humanitarian catastrophe. The reports of CRSV are dire, and I know we all want to see an alleviation of the crisis. In government, we took steps to support partners to care for and protect survivors, and we invested a great deal of energy into trying to bring about a cessation of hostilities. We continue to call for a cessation of violence and for greater access for humanitarian aid so that survivors can access support. So what steps is the Minister taking to progress these aims, but particularly when it comes to upholding the rights of women and girls? The third context I would like to mention is Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories. So let's be clear, we utterly condemn all allegations and reports of CRSV and call for proper investigations and a survivor-centred approach. The 7th of October attacks by Hamas included horrific acts of violence against Israeli women and girls and other civilians, and we express serious concerns at reports of sexual violence against the hostages still held in Hamas captivity. The hostages can and they must be immediately and unconditionally released. Hamas should stop using civilians, including women and girls, as human shields. Last year, as Foreign Secretary, my noble friend Lord Cameron of Chipping Norton announced £4.25 million in UK aid to support the work of UNFPA, the United Nations Sexual and Reproductive Health Agency, who provide life-saving support to vulnerable women and girls. This was expected to reach about 111,500 women, which is around 1 in 5 of the adult women in Gaza. I'd be grateful if the Minister could update us on the latest steps taken to build on this support. Conflict-related sexual violence is a systemic and pervasive abuse that threatens the lives and well-being of women and girls. In government, we led the global conversation on this critical issue that affects millions, and it demands a united approach. I'm proud, Mr Betts, that when we were in government, the UK reached over 4 million people, including survivors, with vital support. But of course, there is still more to do. So I do hope the government will build on our work and strive for a future where CRSV becomes a thing of the past. And I look forward to hearing from the Minister. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr Betts. And it's a real pleasure to serve in this debate with you in the chair. And I'm very grateful to my honourable friend, the member for Norwich North, for securing this incredibly important debate on the impact of conflict on women and girls. I was really grateful to my honourable friend for her very powerful speech, but we've heard so many incredibly powerful speeches today, and I would echo the comments that were made by the member for Strangford, that this is an issue where we can come together and we must come together, and certainly today we did come together across 5 parties, as was mentioned before. So I was really pleased to see that. As so many have mentioned, Mr Betts, this is an incredibly timely debate. Today, conflict's at the highest level since World War II. Women and girls are indeed affected disproportionately. We've had so many examples of that explained today. The number of UN-verified cases of conflict-related sexual violence increased by 50% in 2023, as was mentioned. But also, not a single peace agreement that was reached in 2023 included a women's representative or a women's representative group as a signatory. So there aren't sufficient women at those tables. And the UN Secretary-General's 2023 report highlighted that 172 human rights defenders who were women were subjected to reprisals simply because they engaged with the United Nations for no other reason. These are sobering and concerning statistics. We heard many others in this debate. And it is, of course, 25 years now since the UK played an important part in securing the landmark UN Security Council Resolution 1325, as stated, of course, by my honourable friend for Norwich North. And 30 years have also passed since the Organisation for Security and Cooperation in Europe met in Beijing to agree a central set of international norms on women's rights and gender equality. There are 2 significant milestones that should provide an opportunity for us to be celebrating hard-won gains. But overall, as we've heard, we are going backwards internationally. We will continue, as the new UK government, to build on the ambition from the UK's 5th Women, Peace and Security National Plan. I'm delighted to underline that to the right honourable member for Aldridge Brownhills. This government is determined to work in partnership with others around the world, not least the civil society groups and women peace builders who have key roles to play and who are working on the front line in their communities. And at the United Nations General Assembly last September, the Prime Minister gave a clear commitment to work together for peace, progress and equality. And it's clear that women and girls must be at the heart of that work and indeed at the heart of our development policy. I completely agree with my honourable friend for Norwich North on that. They also need to be at the heart of our work in relation to the climate crisis, I would say to my honourable friend who's no longer in her place. And we ensured that was the case in our representation at COP. Now, empowering women and girls is clearly vital. A number of members, I was pleased to hear, referred to the role of my noble friend, Lord Collins, who's been appointed as the Prime Minister's Special Representative on preventing sexual violence in conflict. And as the Minister for International Development and for Women and Equalities, I'm determined the UK does all it can to prevent and resolve conflict and empower women who are vital to sustainable and inclusive outcomes from conflict situations. My friend for Glasgow West made that point powerfully in relation to Myanmar. It was also raised by my friend for Bathgate and Linlithgow. We're determined to ensure that women are involved in peace building, not just because of the moral case, but as was spelled out particularly by the member for Tunbridge Wells, because there's a very clear empirical case for this as well. When women are involved in peace building in a genuine and significant way, those peace deals tend to stick far more than when they are cut out of the process. And I was absolutely delighted to meet with a number of incredible women when I was in Addis Ababa, women representing civil society from Sudan. They must be part of the future for that country and part of the peaceful resolution of the appalling conflict there. We believe we can make a difference difference as the UK, in the same way that the incredible women mentioned by my honourable friend for Bishop Auckland have made a difference, and it was wonderful to hear what they had done. So first, we must ensure that we listen to women's voices on the ground and that we amplify them. That's a core commitment of the new government. And my friend for Norwich North asked about our approach to focus countries. I think that approach has been incredibly powerful to make sure that we're really driving targeting on this. As the new Minister for International Development, however, I am aware, as many members said, disturbingly, conflict-related sexual violence is becoming much more of a feature of the conflicts that we see around the world. So we need to make sure we're flexible enough on this. So that's what I'm determined to do as the new Minister. We also need to make sure there is that participation, of course, in peace processes. And we need to make sure that applies whether we're talking about formal mechanisms or informal mechanisms. That's included, for example, in Nigeria and in South Sudan. And also, we need to make sure, of course, that their voices are raised when it comes to the impact of that conflict-related sexual violence. And my honourable friend for Norwich North mentioned DRC. We've been supporting women subject to CRSV there, and their voices need to be heard around those appalling crimes. I would mention, Mr Betts, that through the UK's £33 million partnership with the Equality Fund, we have supported over 1,000 women's rights organisations, including in conflict settings. And we need to make sure those voices are heard when it comes to issues like child marriage, which were mentioned by the member for Strangford. I talk with girls in South Sudan and in Zambia. They told me about their concerns around early marriage, around early pregnancy. We need to make sure that their voices are heard, and certainly as a new government we're determined to do that. Secondly, we need to ensure that the needs of women and girls are prioritised when it comes to current crises. Again, when I was in South Sudan, I witnessed firsthand the desperate situation of women and girls affected by the conflict in Sudan. Of course, we did have a debate in the main chamber where we went through what the government was engaged with in relation to Sudan, just specifically when it comes to the actions in relation to women, and particularly some of the atrocities, appalling ones that we've seen, and also responding to the comments on this from the member for Esher and Walton, who I know is very concerned about this. The UK has been working intensively with other countries on this issue. We secured a renewal of the UN fact-finding mission in relation to Sudan. I was really pleased to see additional African countries supporting that. That was incredibly important. Of course, it was awful that Russia vetoed the UN Security Council resolution on Sudan, which we came to jointly with Sierra Leone. We're going to keep pushing on this, and particularly also making sure that in the provision of aid we are acting against that sexual violence and seeking to support survivors. And that has been the case with the UK's support, for example, for refugees based in Chad, and we'll continue to focus on that. In Syria, we've underlined the importance of an inclusive transitional process, protecting the rights of all Syrians, including women and girls, and preventing further instability. And through the Global Survivors Fund, we've provided medical, psychosocial, legal and financial support to over 800 Syrian survivors of sexual violence in Turkey. And in relation to the UN FPA, as rightly mentioned by the Right Honourable Member for Aldridge Brownhills, we are absolutely continuing to support the UN FPA and their incredibly important mission. And, yep, happy to.
The response has been excellent. Thank you for that. In relation to Syria in particular, some of the stories, Mr Chairman, that have come out of Syria since the Assads have lost the power is to do with Christians in Syria specifically. Those on the front line in relation to those of Christians and religious views have been, for instance, the Christmas trees. The Christmas tree was burnt. Has the Minister or has government had any chance yet to talk to the authorities, whatever role they will have in relation to protection for those of a Christian faith and other ethnic faiths in Syria, and particularly to the women who very often are at the forefront of what's taking place?
Thank you, Mr Betts. I'm very grateful to the Honourable Member for raising this. So the UK Government has raised this at official level. The fact there has to be an inclusive future process. It must be one that's inclusive, of course, of different religious groups, ethnic groups, inclusive of women as well. That's incredibly important. So that point has definitely been made. And I would just also say on this, the voices of those Syrians who've been through so much must must be heard here. When I was in Jordan, I met with Syrian refugees, women who had fled from Syria into Jordan. I particularly met with a number of girls as well who were being supported by the UK to access education that they might not otherwise have had access to, of course, working with the Jordanian government on this. And it really is clear that they have got to be part of the future of their country. And that is in line, of course, with the new government's determination to support women's organisations. And that means women's organisations also that represent, of course, women with disabilities as well. So being very thorough around that. Now, in relation to the points that have been made by a number of members about Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories. First of all, Mr Betts, when it comes to Gaza, as mentioned by my honourable friends for Aylesbury, Glasgow, Go West, Washington and Gateshead South, Milton Keynes Central and Bathgate and Linlithgow, and also by the member for Esher and Walton as well. We are also deeply concerned about the situation for healthcare, including for women and girls in Gaza, and indeed for men and boys. Deeply concerned about that situation. I've seen this for myself. When I was in Jordan, I saw medical supplies that should have been in Gaza, that were not in Gaza, that had not been allowed to pass in to Gaza. The government has repeatedly pushed the Israeli government on this. We have raised this continuously, bilaterally, multilaterally. There must be access for all the humanitarian supplies that are needed. That must include medical supplies. And UK aid has indeed been going to women to support them, particularly around sanitation, particularly around the issues raised when it comes to menstruation, also pregnancy as well. And I've discussed this directly with bodies like UK Med and others. It is appalling that to see some of the deeply concerning reports that have come around the treatment of Palestinian detainees as well. This was raised by other members. Detainees must be treated in line with international law. There must be access for the ICRC and reports of sexual violence must be investigated. When it comes to the impact of conflict-related sexual violence on Israelis, of course, this was raised by my friend for Washington and Gateshead South and my friend for Milton Keynes Central and others. I would only add that this issue is causing incredible pain and anguish to the families of hostages. I know this, having spoken with some of them in Tel Aviv, and they're deeply concerned, understandably, about the situation for their family members. Yet another reason why the hostages must be released, why we have to have a ceasefire. We must see that surge of aid into Gaza. My friend for Norwich North specifically asked some questions about Afghanistan, Mr Betts, so I will move to talk about that because, of course, as the Foreign Secretary has said, the Taliban's further oppression of women through its so-called vice and virtue law is appalling, and many members have raised the situation for women and girls in Afghanistan rightly during this debate. She asked specifically about gender apartheid. We are aware of calls for the inclusion of gender apartheid as a new crime against humanity. We are actively considering the legal and policy questions raised by the proposed new crime of gender apartheid, and she asked for more details about what we are doing. Well, we continue to condemn the Taliban's action against women and girls and did so most recently in the December G7 Plus joint statement. We have already said, Mr Betts, as a new government, that we support the initiative to hold the Taliban to account for the violations of CEDAW. Now, I know that many members in this chamber will know what CEDAW is. It's the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination against Women. I'm pleased today that I can report that we will be formally joining the list of countries which have announced their political support for that initiative. So I hope that members will welcome that. Finally, I can state to this committee that this government is, to this chamber, that this government is committed to preventing conflict-related sexual violence against women and girls. That includes also instances of trafficking in relation to Ukraine. We've heard some really disturbing details of that that during this debate. In Ukraine, we provided up to £10.7 million to support projects aimed at building Ukraine's capacity for the domestic investigation and prosecution of war crimes, including conflict-related sexual violence. On the issue specifically of capacity, which was raised rightly by the Right Honourable Member for Aldridge Brownhills, a member of the PSVI team of experts has deployed to Ukraine. That's to support Ukrainian authorities in the investigation and prosecution of conflict-related sexual violence in a survivor-centred manner. So really important to have that expert input there, which we are supporting. Now, when it comes to the broader issue of preventing sexual violence in conflict, in November, Lord Collins visited Colombia in his first official engagement as the Prime Minister's Special Representative. That was leading the UK's delegation to the high-level meeting of the International Alliance on PSVI. And I was pleased to hear the Right Honourable Member for Aldridge Brownhills talking about, of course, that initiative from 2023. We very much support that agenda. We're determined to enhance it. She asked about our plans as well to do so. When Lord Collins was in Bogota, he called for greater international action in response to the increased rates of conflict-related sexual violence around the world. And in response to my friend for Aylesbury, that includes determination to use sanctions where necessary against the perpetrators of these vile crimes. We know that all forms of gender-based violence are preventable. That includes conflict-related sexual violence. And that's why I'm very pleased that we've committed a further £18 million to the UN Trust Fund to end violence against women, as well as providing training on sexual exploitation and abuse for over 2,000 peacekeeping personnel in the last financial year through the British Peace Support Team in Africa. And my friend from Milton Keynes Central, who's no longer not able to still be in her... Oh, she's come back. She's come back. Excellent. She was right to raise this. And I know, Mr Betts, this has been a challenging afternoon for many because we've had a debate on violence against women and girls in the main chamber. So I know many have been shuttling between the two. I will just briefly also mention, Mr Betts, that during the 16 days of activism against violence against women, I announced 3 new partnerships with women's rights organisations in Kenya and South Africa, also to develop new preventative strategies. So, Mr Betts, to conclude, our commitment to have violence against women and girls within a decade and our work with international partners to empower women globally is absolutely critical. We've talked today about how an unprecedented profusion of conflict is having a devastating impact for so many women and girls around the world now. So I underscore this government's unwavering commitment to changing that, ensuring to reuse the quote that was rightly stated from the member for North Herefordshire, that shame must change sides. Should be the perpetrators who are feeling that shame, who are feeling the accountability, and above all, who are deterred from that behaviour in the first place. We're determined to work in partnership with members across this House, key international and multilateral partners, civil society, and most importantly, with women and girls affected on the ground. Thank you.
Alice MacDonald to wind up.
Thank you, Mr Betts, and it's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. I want to thank all the members who have spoken today so powerfully on this subject. As the Minister noted, there were 2 debates at the same time on male violence against women and girls. I know many of us would have liked to speak in both of them, but though the contexts are obviously different, many of the themes will be the same: the oppression of women, systematic discrimination, and the need for leadership and determination. I want to thank the Minister and the Shadow Minister for their responses. We can see so much consensus across both sides of this House, and for the very thorough response to many of the questions that we have raised. We've covered a wide range of subjects and geographies. We've gone all around the world, and we haven't covered all the contexts in which women and girls are suffering. We've heard about many statistics, we've heard about many stories, but importantly we focused on the solutions, because in debates we can spend a lot of time talking about the context without focusing on what we actually really need to do. We've heard of the horrors of the direct and indirect impacts of conflict, the horrors of rape and murder, but also the horrible realities of daily life for so many women and girls. At the beginning of this debate, I said I hoped we could find consensus, and I think we have found it on many, many areas, on the targeting of aid, on the need to involve women in peace processes, and on the need for determination and focused leadership. As the head of UN Women said, women are paying the price for the wars of men, and we need to be clear that we are speaking about male violence. I do want to finish by putting front and centre the women and girls who are in conflict zones, who are fighting so hard for their rights and also just simply to survive, because it is them that we must listen to. And I wanted to finish with the words of one of them, the Nobel laureate and a woman who fought so hard for peace in Liberia, Laima Gbawi. She said, "You can never leave footprints that last if you are always walking on tiptoe." And I think we have heard today that we are not walking on tiptoe on this subject. We will be working at full throttle with determination and focus and leadership, so that finally, maybe one day, that women and girls are not suffering from violence anywhere. Thank you.
The question is, this House has considered the impact of conflict on women and girls. As many that have been say aye. Contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Order, order. The sitting stands adjourned.
Indeed.